Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. Boy, we are just ever so thankful here in southern Oklahoma. We wound up getting a couple of inches of rain. The weather turned really cool. Now, it did knock me out of a swap meet. I will say that. But hey, that's okay because we need, boy, did we need the rain. So we are ever so thankful for the good rain that we got. Well, again, welcome back. We are continuing. Oh, by the way, I've just got to take notice of this. I posted some pictures, just a few, of my new office space. I didn't take very many pictures here in my studio, so I'll correct that and I'll take some pictures of the studio. It's just a little bit small, to be honest about it, but hey, finances are what they were, and if I could have enlarged it like 2 feet either way or both ways, that would have been really, really great. But again, finances didn't permit that. And I didn't have much room to the east of me, and I wanted to allow room between the building here and the fence for the parking of my car trailer that I have. And so if I would have moved it 2 feet that way, I wouldn't have had room. So we were very restricted, not only a financially key issue, but nonetheless, hey, it's absolutely fantastic. And again, for those of you who were kind enough and generous enough to be able to send us some money to help us pay for that, for this, I just want to thank you for it so very, very much. It is truly, truly a blessing. Okay, we are continuing our study of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, and doing the comparison between Matthew 25, 31, and we've been focused on the comparison with 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. As I have stated, 99.9% of all commentators say 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is in fact parallel. It's talking about the same day of the Lord, talking about the same coming of the Lord. Even though, as I have taken note, even though Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following does not specifically mention the vindication of the martyrs as 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 does. It is a logical fallacy. It's a hermeneutical fallacy to say, well, Matthew doesn't mention the martyrs. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 does, therefore they can't be the same. I have demonstrated for you how fallacious of an argument that is. And yet some people keep making the argument. I'm sorry, it's a bad argument. But we have gone from there to demonstrate, and we've just begun demonstrating the parallels between Matthew 25, 31, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. Now, to keep this as simple as possible, let me make the following argument. Virtually all commentators, 99% of them, say that Matthew 25, 31 and following is the last day of the Lord. Okay? Matthew 25, 31 and following is the last day of the Lord. Well, guess what? Isaiah 2 through 4 is about the last day of the Lord. Look at this, Isaiah chapter 2 and following. It shall come to pass in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains and exalted above the hills. Okay? What's the context? What's the framework? It is the last days. But notice that it is also the prediction of the day of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10. Now, there is no contextual break. There's no justification whatsoever for inserting 2,000 years or 2,500 years or 23 or 2,600 years anywhere between Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4 and verse 5 or verse 9. It is a continuous discussion. So verse 10, enter into the rock, hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of men shall be brought low or humbled. The haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, and upon everything lifted up. So, absolutely no question whatsoever that Isaiah 2 through 4 is about the day of the Lord. Now, why is that significant? Well, it is because the New Testament teaches about the coming day of the Lord foretold in the Old Testament. Now, something very important to realize. Most commentators believe that there is one day of the Lord, but that's too generic of a statement. More specifically, they believe there is only one last day of the Lord. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 4 and following, Paul, who remember, his eschatology was nothing but that which was found in the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. By the way, let me digress here just a moment. Just the other day, a, quote, former preterist got on Facebook and said, preterists like to say all prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70. And he shows where the New Testament writers use the language of Isaiah chapter 13 and the language of the day of the Lord of hosts of Isaiah chapter 13. And he made the argument, well, look, Isaiah chapter 13 is the judgment of Babylon, and it says it was at hand. But the day of the Lord of Isaiah 13, the day of the Lord against Babylon, was that fulfilled in AD 70? Because after all, the day of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 13 in verse 6 was at hand. It was near. It was coming shortly. So that means one of two things, or so this former preterist said. It means that time statements don't mean anything at all. At hand doesn't mean near, soon, shortly, coming quickly, or imminent. Oh, no. Or it means that Isaiah 13 and the prophecy of the judgment of Babylon was in AD 70. Well, look, this former preterist knows that is a fallacious argument. They know that is false. What's happening with Isaiah 13? Is it a prediction of the day of the Lord? Well, it most assuredly is. Pardon me. It's what the text says. Is it the last day of the Lord? No, it is not. And by the way, according to even the Bible Knowledge Commentary, which is a dispensational commentary, by the way, folks, by Walvoord and Zook, they admit that within 15 years, Babylon was destroyed by the Assyrians, and then you have piled onto that the later destruction by the Medes and the Persians, spoken of in verse 17 and following of Isaiah 13. So even dispensationalists recognize this is talking about the destruction of Babylon that occurred at the end of, at the hands of the Assyrians, and then later at the hands of the Medo-Persians. And thus, this former preterist knows he's going against even some scholarship, dispensational scholarship, when he tries to make this argument. But you see, here's the deal. There are many days of the Lord in the Old Testament. Many of them. There was the day of the Lord against Babylon. There was the day of the Lord against Egypt. There was the day of the Lord against Tyre and against Sidon, Ezekiel chapter 30 through 33. There was the day of the Lord against Jerusalem. There was the day of the Lord against the 10 northern tribes. Now, in all of those days of the Lord, what do we have? We have very similar language. What do I mean by that? We have the prophecy of the Lord coming out of heaven, walking on the tops of the mountains, the earth melting beneath his feet. In Isaiah chapter 34, the great day of the Lord of hosts, even the constellations of the heavens are melted. The stars fall from the sky. Here's my point. There's not just one day of the Lord. Okay? Now, there's only one last day's day of the Lord. Joel chapter 2, 28 and following. Isaiah chapter 2. But there are many Old Testament days of the Lord. These were, and look, men such as Kenneth Gentry agree, Gary DeMar agrees, Joel McDermott agreed, Keith Matheson agrees. All of these post-millennial writers absolutely agree with this. Jim Jordan, with whom I had a debate some years ago, he agrees. There's all of these days of the Lord in the Old Testament in which the language is identical. It is called decreation language. And, pardon me, in my book, Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory, or in my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, I examine many, many of those Old Testament prophecies showing that the language is identical. They are not all talking about the same day of the Lord, however. So, when this former preterist tries to say, well, you've got Isaiah 13. Look at this language of the day of the Lord. It's the day of the Lord against Babylon. But that wasn't fulfilled. Near, quickly, shortly. So, preterists are in a paradox here. That must mean that Isaiah 13 wasn't fulfilled until AD 70, destroying the time statement of Isaiah 13. No, this former preterist knows without a doubt that is a false argument. True preterists, believe that Isaiah 13 and the language of the day of the Lord was fulfilled at the hands of the Assyrians in the 8th century BC. The New Testament uses that identical language of decreation, Matthew chapter 24, 29 and following, to describe the coming last day of the Lord. Well, I've taken up the time this morning, but do yourself a favor, get a copy of my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, or Like Father, Like Son, and learn for yourself how the Hebrew prophets used language. They used language to speak of God's intervention into history by using one nation to judge another nation. When God used one nation to judge another nation, it was said that he came. He came on the clouds of heaven. He came with flaming fire. He came with the angels. He walked on the tops of the mountains. He came with a shout, with a trumpet. On and on and on it goes. But he never, ever came literally, visibly, or bodily. And guess what? Jesus said he was going to come in the glory of the Father. He was going to come like the Father had come many times before. Thus, when the New Testament writers use the language of the day of the Lord, they're not saying that Isaiah 13 was going to be fulfilled in their lifetime, or even at some point of time in the future. No. They're just simply using stock in trade language that was common to the Hebrew prophets to say, like God came then, Jesus is coming in the same way. And he's coming soon, quickly, shortly. Behold, I come quickly, said Jesus, Revelation 22:12. It's an abuse of logic. It's an abuse of hermeneutic to say that the New Testament writers were anticipating the fulfillment of Isaiah 13 or any of those other non-last days of the Lord that use the language of imminence in their lifetime. Well, I'm out of time, but it was important to get this, hermeneutical primer, if you please, before us as we begin to examine Isaiah chapter 2 through 4 and its prediction of the last days, day of the Lord, which the New Testament writers and which Jesus himself applied to AD 70. But we'll talk about that more on the flip side. I'll see you there.